The A6M2, an icon of the rising sun. The premier Japanese carrier-borne fighter has racked up a fantastical reputation. Agile and swift, the Zero served as a nasty surprise to the Allies in World War II. Even after defeat, this plane stands as perhaps one of the most potent machines of the early years of war in the Pacific. Pitted against it, fighters that barely stood a chance, written off in popular memory as obsolescent, clumsy, or inadequate. But is this a fair assessment? Let us compare the A6M2 with the American F4F Wildcat. As one of the most classic aerial duels of World War II, comparison between these two fighters can teach us valuable lessons not only about the aircraft involved, but also of the shifting nature of aerial warfare. Note that for this comparison, all future mentions of the A6M2 and Zero refer to the A6M2 Mod 21, and all mentions of the F4F refer to the F4F-4 unless specifically mentioned. Also note that the purpose of this video is not to convince you that one plane was better than the other. Instead, it is here to inform you so that you have the knowledge and the context required to make an informed judgment yourself. Let us start with the basics. The A6M2 was a single-engine plane, capable of being operated on both land and sea via the use of carriers. Powered by the Nakajima Sake 12, a 14-cylinder radial engine that produced just shy of 1000 horsepower, it did not have the strongest power plant of its time. However, the Zero's lightweight structure and emphasis on weight shedding during the construction countered this deficiency. Empty, an A6M2 weighed 3,700 pounds, loaded 5,300 pounds. Overall, the plane was fantastically agile and responsive to the pilot. There is a caveat attached to this, however, something we'll go into later on. Top speed of the Zero is somewhat disputed. Factoring together most sources, top speed is set somewhere between 330 to 345 miles an hour. In his book Samurai, Japanese ace Saburo Sakai states 345 miles an hour, basing it on his own experience with the airplane. US tests were done with captured airplanes that needed repairs before being airworthy once more. This obviously influenced aerodynamics. To prevent a breakdown and thus the loss of a valuable trophy, US tests were also conducted by using a safe engine setting and thus not going full out with the engine. This results in top speeds that fall as low as 280 miles an hour and are not realistic. As such, for the purpose of this video, I will assume a top speed of around 330 miles an hour with boost, as such a figure seems likely and is supported by various sources. Its service ceiling was around 37,000 feet, and its operational range of 1,160 miles, unheard of at the time for a plane of its kind. Armed with two rifle caliber Type 97 machine guns, holding 680 rounds each, and two Type 99-1 20mm cannons holding 60 rounds each, the plane boasted a similar armament to the German Bf-109 Emil. When flying into combat, the Japanese used the Shotai, a free airplane formation, similar to the standard Vic formation of the time. This flight consisted of one leader and two wingmen. Just like the pilots from other nations, the Japanese quickly noticed that the V was too rigid and inflexible in combat. As such, next to Germany, Japan became one of the first countries to turn their backs on the old way of flying into combat. Instead, a more loosened formation was proposed. Typically, the leader and one wingman would fly ahead. The distance between these could be up to 200 meters. The wingman would also fly slightly higher than the leader. The second wingman was even further back and the highest in the formation. This way, the Shotai had better fields of view and could concentrate on searching potential targets. This formation presented further advantages over the standard Vic, for example allowing pilots to organically adopt line abreast or line astern just before attacking an enemy. The leader could also opt to keep the third wingman as a high lookout or cover when engaging in combat. Defensive options were on the table too. The loose and staggered formation allowed mutual support and covering arcs of fire. The Shotai was definitely better suited to air combat than the Vic it was based on. In contrast to the Zero, the F4F Wildcat gives the impression of being a brute. Compact and buff, its design radiates strength over finesse. Like the Zero, it could operate on both land and sea as a carrier-borne single-engine fighter. With 1,200 horsepower out of its Pratt & Whitney, the plane could be assumed to outperform the Zero in terms of speed. This is not the case. While the F4F-3 was closer to the Zero speed, The heavier F4F-4 was slower and managed to clock up only about 318 miles an hour at 19,000 feet. Compensating this, the spare horsepower did allow for a sturdy, heavy construction. On a scale, the F4F hits 5,700 pounds empty and could weigh nearly 8,000 pounds loaded, although typical configuration stayed around 7,500 pounds. The eventual modifications on armor and the introduction of self-sealing fuel tanks alone increased the weight by 900 pounds. It has a service ceiling of around 34,000 feet, and its range is only 770 miles. Armed with 6 M2 Browning machine guns with 240 rounds per gun, the plane had a streamlined armament that was sufficient for the task in the Pacific. When war broke out with Japan, the US Navy is often reported to having persisted in the use of the increasingly obsolete V formation, with no modifications being made to the status quo. While it is true that by the time the European War erupted, the favored doctrine remained the good old Vic, it omits some of the experimentation that was conducted by VF2 and VF5, two Navy squadrons, and the eventual decision to stop flying Vic a few months before Pearl Harbor. Already in peacetime, the Navy had flown trial missions of two-man flights. Spacing two aircraft apart by around 150 feet, ample room was created for flexibility and mutual support. Each squadron had 18 aircraft, set up into 3 divisions of 6. These would then be further split up into 2 plane elements. Staggering the formation and flying in echelons, the distance between each flight was about 300 feet. Before the war broke out, the famous Fatch Reef was developed by Lieutenant John Fatch. Apparently inspired by a rudimentary intelligence report on the Zero, he was one of the few not to ignore the potential danger. Taking 2 elements of 2 aircraft, the planes would be flying in a beam defense position. The weave would be executed as an enemy fighter approaches. Should the right element be attacked, it would brake left. The left element mirrors the move, forcing a head-on with the enemy. This, so it was hoped, would either ensure a destroyed enemy plane, or at least a startled enemy pilot who breaks off the attack. If necessary, the move could be repeated. This move could naturally also be conducted between 2 aircraft. Before we pit the A6M2 against the Wildcat, however, let us compare the 2 fighters in more detail and shine some more light on their operational capabilities. As mentioned, the A6M2 had a mixed armament of rifle caliber machine guns and cannons. 2 Type 97 machine guns were placed on the engine, synchronized with the propeller, holding 680 rounds per gun. A license-produced Vickers Class E machine gun, it fired a 7.7 x 56mm R round. It could fire standard ball, AP, tracer and incendiary ammunition. A small 7.7 HE round was also available. The 2 Type 99-1 20mm cannons were placed in the wings and held 60 rounds each. This provided the Zero with a good punch on paper, yet the 2 20mm cannons were quickly expended. Similar to the German MGFF, it was the Japanese version of the Oerlikon FF, but lighter in weight than the original and its German counterpart. It was officially termed as a machine gun, firing a 20 x 72mm RB round. It had 4 different rounds. The HE round had an explosive content of around 11 grams. In comparison, the German mine shell in the MGFF-M had 20 grams. The incendiary round had a filling of 6 grams of explosives and chemicals. The tracer held 5 grams of explosive, the AP round held 4 grams. The low muzzle velocity of 600 meters per second made aiming difficult, and the overall punch of this specific cannon was lower than other 20mm cannons of the time. Some Japanese pilots even reported to prefer the machine guns over the cannons, but this seems to stem mainly out of the early operations where enemy planes gave up easy targets, with Zeros being able to follow every maneuver glued to the tail of their adversary. The Wildcat had a streamlined armament of 4 and later 6 12.7 M2 Brownings, the famous 50 cal. Firing the 12.7 x 99mm round, its API ammunition had a muzzle velocity of 890 meters per second. The F4F-3 held 450 rounds per gun, allowing for 34 seconds of fire. The 240 rounds per gun on the F4F-4 allowed for around 20 seconds. As such, some pilots opted to omit the additional 250 cals in the -4. The Ma-2 was well suited to the Pacific theater in the way that the Japanese never really fielded tough aircraft that could withstand a barrage of shots from this caliber. The good rate of fire, tightly packed spread of shots enabled pilots to spray down an enemy aircraft and inflict serious damage with a good lead. With a good ammo load, the F4F Wildcat held enough ammo for most engagements and thus did not feature the same problem as the Zero, that lost most of its firepower once it had expanded its cannons. As Navy fighters, the operational range of both aircraft was paramount. Here, the Zero is a clear winner with a range of up to 300 miles further than the Wildcat. However, both aircraft featured the optional choice of a drop tank. On the Zero, a centerline 330-liter drop tank could be installed, boosting its maximum range over an incredible 3,000 kilometers. That's more than 1,900 miles. The F4F-3 held 147 gallons of fuel and had a natural range of up to 830 miles, while the F4F-4 lost some of it and could only reach around 765 miles. Two wing-mounted 85-gallon drop tanks could be installed, propping up the total fuel load to 260 gallons. Throughout my research, I've found conflicting information on the maximum range of the F4F-4 equipped with drop tanks. It seems likely that it could fly, depending on the setup, for a distance of 1,200 to 1,400 miles. Some figures quote as much as 1,600 miles, but at any rate, it stays behind the Zero. The Zero could be equipped with a bomb load of 132 pounds, with one 66-pound bomb fixed under each wing. One 550-pound bomb could potentially be equipped as well. The Wildcat could mount up to 200 pounds of ordnance, one 100-pound bomb under each wing. Overall, this was extremely rare. I found one statistic from 1946 that mentions only 154 tons of ordnance were dropped from the Wildcats. Assuming that this is a US ton, this would mean only about 3,000 bombs were dropped from F4Fs throughout the war. This is less than some bomber formations would drop in a day. As such, while both planes had the option to load bombs, practicality and lethality of these bombs was limited and they were thus seldom used. Both planes featured an optional storage concession. The tips of the A6M2 wings could be folded over, decreasing the width of the aircraft by 40 inch to 36 feet for storing purposes. For the F4F-4, the wings could be folded rearward, decreasing the necessary space for storage by half. This allowed fighter squadrons to own carriers to double their complement of Wildcats and rapidly transport multiple F4Fs to the flight deck from the carrier. It should be noted that the initial clashes between the Allies and the Zero were not with the F4F. Instead, the older Buffaloes, Hurricanes, P-40s, P-400s and P-39s bore the brunt of the fight. While some of these planes had some advantages over the Zero, initial combat performance was largely poor. Many reasons were given as to why the Japanese pilots and fighters were somehow performing better, with many empty excuses making up the bulk of them. Some Allied personnel even chose to ignore facts and pretended that nothing bad was happening. One of the main problems was that Allied pilots had been trained in a manner that played into the hands of the Japanese pilot. Having been drilled in the art of dogfighting, but possessing a little combat experience, the Allied pilot was at the mercy of the battle-hardened Japanese, whose plane was simply better in a close-quarter dogfight. To put things into perspective, the pilots on the Japanese carrier groups had an average operational flight time of 600 to 800 hours, including the combat missions they flew in China. In contrast, in 1939, Navy pilots had only racked up around 200 hours during flight training, and only by 1941 did they benefit by additional training of up to 150 hours in the advanced carrier training groups. To make matters worse, it was also in 1941 that the Navy abolished the requirement that their carrier pilots be trained in the use of all carried aircraft, so fighters, dive bombers and torpedo bombers. This means that just before the war in the Pacific commenced, Navy pilots had only half the flight time of Japanese pilots, very few hours in operational missions, and none in combat missions. And the time they had racked up was distributed between 3 different types of aircraft. The US military was unable to provide factual data on the Zero to its pilots until late 1942. Based on a captured Zero at Akutan Island in June 1942, valuable lessons were drawn from Information Intelligence Summary number 85. It was also surveys like these that served as proof, supporting what the pilots at the front lines were saying for some time. The Zero is a better dogfighter, and it cannot be beaten using our conventional methods. Quote from the frank and matter-of-fact IIS number 85. The Zero fighter has superior maneuverability to all present service-type aircraft. An outstanding characteristic of the Zero is its high rate of zoom. US service-type ships will stall out at the steep angle where the Zero has just reached its most maneuverable speed. In other words, if you follow a Zero in a steep climb at low speeds, you'll rest in pieces. It should be remembered that these conclusions were drawn from a captured airplane that needed repairs, and that due to the lower than max engine setting was flying somewhat slower than it would on the front lines. In fact, each American document on the Zero quotes a different speed figure, even when the same plane was tested. During the tests, comparison flights were conducted against a handful of American planes. These clearly detailed the strong points of the A6M2, but also gave definite data on its weaknesses. We are going to focus on the findings of the comparison with the F4F. Against the F4F, the Zero is quoted as being superior to the F4F-4 in speed and climb at all altitudes above 1000 feet. It is superior in service ceiling and range. Close to sea level, the two planes are equal in level speed. The Zero and the F4F are equal in dive. End of quote. The latter point is interesting as it seems to be contradictory to some of the conceptions we have of the Zero. We will return to this topic soon. Documents also states that there is no comparison between the turn of both airplanes, since the Zero does it that well and it's not even a contest. The conclusions were as follows. The F4F-4 in combat with the Zero is basically dependent on mutual support and internal protection. Advantage of the superiority of the F4F in pushovers and rolls at high speeds should be taken. The document states that beyond the speed of 300 miles an hour, which is just below the maximum speed in level flight attainable by the aircraft, the Zero becomes increasingly sluggish and unresponsive, and that it has troubles with negative G maneuvers. Based on this, the recommendations were to never dogfight a Zero, stay above 300 miles an hour in a fight with the Zero unless one holds a favorable position, never follow a climbing Zero at slow speeds. Airplanes expected to fight the Zero were also recommended to ditch all non-essential equipment. The document thus agrees in some point with pilots that responded unfavorably to the increased weight of the F4F-4 over the -3. Yet, as we noticed, it also states that in a fight with a Zero, internal protection was important. Of course, having gone through the findings, we are hardly surprised. Much of this information seems common sense to us based on what we know now. In this, we are somewhat mirrored by the service pilots that were fighting the Zeros in the field. However, IIS number 85 should not be disregarded since it gave concrete black and white information that the behind the frontline personnel could digest, and this would serve to assist aircraft designers and theorists in their work. Ironically, IIS number 85 was just finished when the Japanese started to substitute the A6M2 with the newer A6M3. As we will see, however, by this point the frontline pilots had already come to blows with the Japanese for months, racking up valuable experience against the Zero. Let us make our way to the front line. The F4F was not the plane to suffer the brunt of the Japanese offensive. Instead, Brewster Buffaloes, Hawker Hurricanes, P-36s and P-40s were engaged in the fight. These initial engagements were largely dominated by the A6M2. While various Allied units did find ways to at least deter the Japanese fighters in some way, most of these machines simply did not allow for anything more than a token resistance. While we could go into detail into the first months of fighting, one specific quote sums it up pretty well. In a campaign lasting less than 3 months, the 2 Japanese units, which never mustered more than 220 A6M2s, defeated Allied forces of some 550 aircraft, including 50 Brewster Buffaloes, 24 Curtiss-Wright Interceptors, 20 Curtiss Hawk 75 A7s, and 48 Hawker Hurricanes, some 40 P-40s, an additional 33 Hawker Hurricanes, and a few Brewster Buffaloes. At Wake Island in December of 1941, a handful of F4F-3s had their first fights with Japanese Zeros. Most of them were destroyed on the ground without ever making it into the sky to defend the island. Regardless, they are credited with the destruction of at least 2 Zeros. During the operation, a Wildcat armed with 2 100-pound bombs is also credited with the kill on the Japanese destroyer Kisaragi. This is probably the first and most famous and only effective use of bombs on a Wildcat throughout the whole war. Roughly half a year before IIS number 85 was released, the Zeros were starting to increasingly run into Wildcats. Duking it out over the Coral Sea on May 7, 1942, Task Force 17 launched an attack on the IJN carrier Shoho. As the Japanese concentrated their defensive attacks on the incoming torpedo bombers, the 8 F4F-3s from VF-42 were left relatively alone. Of the 3 Zeros in the air, 1 was shot down. The next day, another division of VF-42, probably 6 machines, once again escorted torpedo bombers. In this, they were supported by 9 Wildcats from VF-2. On the action that day, 3 Wildcats were lost, while claiming 3 zeros. Interestingly, the claims of the Japanese pilots amount up to 18 Wildcats, more than were probably in the air that day. Later in the day, the Japanese attack was escorted by 18 zeros and met by 20 Wildcats. The Wildcats, that had to focus their attacks on both the zeros and the incoming attack aircraft, had a pretty rough time. 3 planes were lost. It seems probable that only 1 zero was shot down. In his after-action report, Lieutenant Commander James Flatley states, "The F4F-3 airplane properly handled can beat the enemy carrier-based fighters encountered so far. This includes Type 0. He goes on to state that the most effective attack is to obtain altitude advantage, dive in, attack and pull up using speed captured in the dive. The old dogfighting of chasing tails is not satisfactory and must not be employed when opposing Jap VF fighter planes." Flatley also outlined some tips for his pilots and the hints to Navy VF pilots. It includes the following statements. If you get into a tough spot, dive away, maneuver violently, find a cloud. Stay together. The Japs' air discipline is excellent. The Japs have a method of creating smoke from their exhaust, which doesn't mean a thing. Set them on fire before you take your guns off them. End of quotes. If you are confused about the last one, just remember that when the Zero went into boost, its exhaust would show a flame out and thick smoke would trail the aircraft. This caused some Allied pilots to believe the Zero was hit and was going down, when in reality all was fine. Flatley's statements are of particular interest because of 2 reasons. First, this is a sobering assessment of the reality, affirming that the Japanese plane has the trump cards in a classic engagement. On the other hand, it also outlines the quintessential changes that were developing in aerial warfare, with Flatley probably being one of the first Navy pilots to realize the full extent of it. Flatley's comments were widely distributed among Navy pilots. Another aspect I want to mention is Flatley's comments about the dive performance of the F4F-3 against the Zero. Here, a few months before IIS number 85, that, as you will remember, states that the Zero and the F4F are similar in dive, he flat out comments that the F4F is superior in that aspect. I assume at this point that the approximate nature of IIS number 85 is the nature of its claim, perhaps referring more to the initial dive phase where a Zero could stay on a Wildcat for a short period of time. In June 1942, over Midway, the Wildcat and Zero would clash again. Thatch utilized his weave for the first time, forcing his F4F into head-ons multiple times. He and his wingmen shot down 4 Zeros. His division claimed another 2. The division only experienced 1 loss, however each aircraft had suffered damage. The Wildcat's ruggedness was making its mark. Later that day, another 5 Zero kills were claimed, to the loss of 4 Wildcats. Although a positive kill count had been established throughout the fighting that day, Thatch, just like when he had received the first reports on the Zero, had only an eye for reality. Commenting on the day in his after-action report, Thatch states, "It is surprising that any of our pilots returned alive. Any success against the Japanese Zero fighter is not due to the performance of the airplane we fly, but is the result of comparatively poor marksmanship of the Japanese, stupid mistakes made by a few of their pilots, and superior marksmanship and teamwork of some of our pilots." On the F4F he states, "The F4F airplane is pitifully inferior in climb, maneuverability and speed." End of quotes. Thatch's comments suggest that the Navy's focus on gunnery training was starting to pay off, and that his particular precautions had achieved the desired effect. Yet, his comments on the enemy pilots also highlight another key element. The enemy was overconfident, or maybe increasingly fielding pilots with limited experience. The following actions at Guadalcanal amplified this, although overclaiming became common on the side of the Navy. A spectacular example of this is on August 24, 1942, when VMF-223 intercepted attack aircraft in Zeros. The US pilots claimed 11 bombers and 5 Zeros. The Japanese, however, only lost 3 bombers and 1 Zero. In turn, they also claimed 15 Wildcats. Actual losses were 3 F4Fs. US pilots claimed another 15 Zeros later that day, and 2 days later, VMF-223 claimed another 8 bombers and 5 Zeros. Only 3 A6M2s were actually lost. On August 30, 14 Zeros were claimed, although only 9 were lost. Even though the actual loss rates of the Japanese were lower than the US believed, every loss on the Japanese side stung deep. Japanese fighter pilots had obtained their position after grueling training, truly making them into expert pilots even before going into combat. Yet the time needed and requirements placed on them were not realistic in sustaining a fighter force during a full-scale war, especially against an enemy that holds numerical superiority in the sky. In the book Samurai, Saburo Sakai's discourse on the training regime he underwent is telling. Even though the English translation has quite some hyperbole added to it, the facts remain. Even under the revised and quickening training regimes, new pilots were coming in too few and far in between. To make matters worse, the comparative low survivability of the Japanese planes against the American planes prevented many novice pilots from getting away from a fight with nothing but a blue eye and a bruised pride. Instead, their planes went down to damage that an F4F was able to sustain. Two more comments by US commanders are interesting, considering that the F4F was now holding its own against the Zero. The first comes from Lieutenant Commander Leroy Simpler, who commanded VF5. When he was told that some US tests had placed the F4F-4 to be equal in speed to the Zero, he said that the report was flat wrong. Major John Smith, commander of VMF 223 at Guadalcanal, mentions that they had much more performance than we had. I think they did because we just couldn't stay with them at all and dogfight at any altitude. As such, while the US pilots were able to slowly turn the tide in the F4F, no one was under any illusions. The success was attained by a mix of proper tactics, good gunnery, and disciplined flying in a plane that was able to take a beating. Until a better plane was not available, the Wildcat pilots could only go so far. It should be mentioned once more that the Navy squadrons had two contextual advantages over other units in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. First, they were some of the last to engage the Zeros and could thus draw on some rudimentary reports coming in from the front lines. This allowed them to get ready ahead of time. Second, the initiative of a few individuals such as Flatley and Thatch, as well as the comparative success early on against the Zero, gave the Navy pilots confidence. This was, in many ways, half the battle won. By 1943, tactics used against Japanese Zeros were established, with new pilots benefiting from the experience of the early generation. The combat tactics stressed that altitude and a positional advantage had to be attained before any offensive action could be contemplated, and that pilots should disengage when spotting high-flying enemy fighters on an intercept course. The sections were instructed in combining firepower on individual targets, slashing at the enemy one plane at a time. This allowed the US Navy to effectively engage the Zero. As a concluding example, let us pit a section of two Wildcats against the standard Japanese Shotai. Unless pressed, the section will attempt to gain altitude advantage or hold off until a tactical advantage can be gained. Usually, 2000 feet of altitude advantage was deemed optimal. From there, the section would concentrate on the highest Zero, the tail end. After a gun pass, it would extend and reset its positional advantage by zoom climbing back to altitude. Whether the enemy fighter was destroyed or not matters little, as long as the gained speed in a dive can be successfully reset into the altitude. Should one Zero try to brake and climb up, the focus would switch to it. This way, the enemy was continuously forced to act defensively and thus unable to seize a favorable position to gain the initiative. Even though the whole Shotai might not be destroyed, 1 or 2 kills could be obtained to no friendly losses, but only as long as no one got cocky. To conclude, when comparing aircraft in respective kill counts, it should be remembered that the fighter aircraft is nothing but a vessel. Beyond its performance, the single determining factor of success is the pilot. This is as true in the Pacific as in Europe, or on the Eastern Front, regardless of the period we are in. While various aircraft in the Allied arsenal were less able to counter the A6M2, the specific traits of the F4F ensured that competent and disciplined pilots, using the right tactics, could effectively engage a Zero. Units such as the American Volunteer Group in China or the Navy Squadron adapted their tactics and utilized the strong points of their planes where they existed over the Japanese aircraft. Thus they were successful where others were not. Regardless, it was not until the next generation of Navy planes, such as the F6F Hellcat or the F4U Corsair, that the Americans had planes that were significantly more suited in a fight against the Zero. In the Solomons, between February 1943 and February 1944, 601 A6Ms were shot down and the Japanese lost 481 Zero pilots. This is based on verified Japanese records. The Allies lost 486 aircraft in total, with 526 aircrews lost, although these losses are not verified and might be slightly higher in reality. An estimated 144 were F4U Corsairs, 55 were Wildcats, 41 were Hellcats, 90 were P-38 Lightnings, 62 were P-40s, and then we have another 4 P-47s. The rest were attack aircraft, floatplanes or bombers. While the Zero obviously still had fight in it, the tide had turned. I hope that you enjoyed this video and learned something from it. As usual, my sources are in the description. Make sure to share this video with your friends and pass by those like buttons on your way out. If you would like to learn more about a very special German night fighter squadron, the Wild Boars, click here. And if you want to learn something about Japanese Navy attack aircraft tactics, check out this video by Military History Visualized. As always, have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky.